In the autumn of 1558, a young woman sat reading under an oak tree in a quiet park in Hertfordshire, some 20 miles north of London. The grass was wet. The light was thin and low, the kind of November light that never quite becomes day. She was 25 years old, pale, red-haired, dressed plainly, and she had spent almost her entire life waiting for someone else to decide whether she would be allowed to live. Then horsemen came up the long avenue, mud on their boots, their breath steaming in the cold, and they knelt in the wet grass before her. Her elder sister, the Queen, was dead. The crown of England had passed to her. She did not cry out. She did not rise at once. According to the story that came down afterward, she stayed where she was for a long moment. And then she spoke a line of Latin from the Psalms, saying that this was the Lord's doing, and it was marvellous in her eyes. She had good reason to find it marvellous. She had been declared a bastard by her own father. Her mother had been beheaded before she was 3 years old. She had been questioned by hard men in cold rooms about treasons she had not committed. She had been carried through the Watergate of the Tower of London in the rain, convinced she would not come out again. She had learned, in a court where a wrong sentence could kill you, to say almost nothing, and to mean several things at once. Now she would rule for 44 years. She would refuse every man who asked to marry her, and she would be asked by half the princes of Europe. She would send her sister Queen and cousin to the block. She would face the largest invasion fleet the world had yet seen, and watch it broken by wind and fire. Under her, a small, damp, quarrelsome, second-rate kingdom on the edge of the known world would begin to write plays that people would still be performing 400 years later, and she would do all of it while wearing deliberately the mask of a woman who had given up her private life entirely, who claimed to be married to her country and to no one else, and who let her own image be painted over so many times that we can no longer be sure what she really looked like at the end. This is the entire story of Elizabeth Tudor, the world she was born into, the years she spent in danger, the long reign, the wars, the words, and the quiet room in Richmond Palace where it all came to a close. Settle in, let your shoulders drop. There is no hurry tonight. If you are listening from somewhere far away, leave a note saying where you are and what time it is where you are sitting, and then let the fire burn low, and let us begin at the beginning, in the reign of her father. To understand Elizabeth, you have to understand the strange, unstable country she was born into, and the enormous, restless man who made it that way. England in the early 1500s was small. Perhaps 2.5 million people lived in it, fewer than live in a single large city today. Most of them were farmers. They lived in villages of timber and thatch and daub. They walked everywhere. They knew the names of the fields around them, and they measured the year not in dates, but in saints' days and harvests, and the long, dark stretch between Martinmas and spring. The great forests still ran deep. Wolves were gone from England by then. But wild boar were not, and the roads outside the towns were tracks of mud that turned to soup in winter. London was the exception. Perhaps 50,000 people lived crammed inside its walls and spilling out beyond them, along the river, in a tangle of overhanging houses and narrow lanes that smelled of smoke, tallow, fish, and the Thames. One bridge crossed the river, lined with shops and houses so tightly built that a traveller crossing it might not realise there was water underneath. Beyond the bridge, the road ran south to Southwark, where the theatres and bare pits and less respectable pleasures would one day gather. Over all of it, since 1509, had reigned Henry VIII. It is difficult now to recover how astonishing Henry seemed when he was young. He came to the throne at 17, tall for his age, Athletic, gold-haired, a fine musician, a good linguist, a tireless jouster. He wrote songs. He argued theology. Foreign ambassadors sent home descriptions of his calves. He seemed, to a country that had just come through decades of dynastic civil war, like a promise that the bad years were over. His father, Henry VII, had won the crown on a battlefield and spent the rest of his life making sure nobody took it back. The Tudors were a new family with a thin claim, and they knew it. Everything depended on continuity. Everything depended on sons. Henry married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the Spanish monarchs, a serious, pious, intelligent woman who had already been married briefly to Henry's dead elder brother. For years, she was pregnant, and for years the children died. A son, born on New Year's Day in 1511, lived 7 weeks. There were stillbirths, miscarriages, infants who breathed and then did not. Out of all of it, one child survived, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. A daughter was not nothing, but in Henry's mind, a daughter was not enough. No woman had ruled England in her own right and made it stick. The one attempt 4 centuries earlier had ended in a civil war so miserable that chroniclers said Christ and his saints slept. Henry looked at his only living child, and he looked at the great families of England who would circle a girl on the throne like dogs, and he decided that God must be punishing him. Then he fell in love. Anne Boleyn was the daughter of an ambitious diplomat. Raised partly in the sophisticated courts of the Low Countries and France, she was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of the time. She had dark eyes, dark hair, an olive complexion, a sharp wit, and a French polish that made the English girls at court look provincial. She sang, she danced, she argued, and she read the new religious writers coming out of Germany, the ones who were saying dangerous things about the authority of the Pope. What she also had, and this is the part that changed history, was the nerve to refuse. Her own sister had been Henry's mistress. Anne would not be. If he wanted her, he could marry her. The problem was that he already had a wife, and the Pope would not annul the marriage. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, and in 1527 the Emperor's soldiers had sacked Rome and effectively taken the Pope into custody. No Pope in that position was going to insult the most powerful man in Europe by declaring his aunt's marriage void. So Henry did something no English king had ever done. Over 7 years of pressure, argument, threat, and legislation, he simply removed England from the authority of Rome. In 1533, he married Anne in secret while she was already pregnant. In 1534, Parliament declared him supreme head of the Church of England. The monasteries, which had held perhaps a quarter of the land in England, were surveyed, closed, and sold off within a few years, their lead stripped from the roofs, their libraries scattered, their communities pensioned or turned out. The great abbeys became quarries. In the countryside, people watched buildings that had stood for 400 years come down in a season. Some of this was faith. Henry had genuine, if idiosyncratic, religious convictions. Much of it was money and power. All of it was permanent. The England Elizabeth would inherit was made in those years, and so was the wound that ran through it. Into that world, in the early autumn of 1533, at Greenwich Palace beside the Thames, Anne Boleyn gave birth. The astrologers had promised a boy. The letters announcing the birth of a prince had already been written, and the clerks had to squeeze an extra letter into the word to make it princess. Henry cancelled the tournament that had been planned. He was, by all accounts, gracious about it in public and furious in private. The child was named Elizabeth, after both her grandmothers. She was christened 3 days later in the Church of the Observant Friars at Greenwich. carried under a canopy, the walls hung with tapestry, the font raised on a platform so the crowd could see. Trumpets sounded. 500 torches escorted her back to the palace through the September dark. She would not remember any of it. What she would inherit from that day was something else entirely, and it would take a long time to name. For the first 2.5 years of her life, Elizabeth was the heir to the throne of England. She was given her own household at Hatfield, north of London, which was the normal arrangement for royal children. Fresh air, away from the disease of the city, staffed by a governess and nurses and laundresses and grooms. Her half-sister Mary, 17 years older and now formally declared illegitimate, was made to join that household as an attendant, which was a calculated humiliation Mary never forgot and never forgave. Anne visited. There are letters about the child's clothes, about caps of purple and white satin, about the moment the first teeth came through. For a short while, in a world of appalling political violence, there was a small girl in a country house being fussed over in the ordinary way. Then the ground moved again. Anne miscarried a son in January 1536, on the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral. Henry had already begun to look elsewhere, at a quiet, pale young woman from Wiltshire named Jane Seymour. And once Henry began to look elsewhere, the machinery of the Tudor court began, quietly and efficiently, to arrange the removal of the obstacle. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and taken to the Tower. She was accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, and of plotting the king's death. The charges were, by any reasonable reading of the evidence, fabricated. Dates did not match, locations did not match. It did not matter. The men were tried and condemned. Anne was tried in the Great Hall of the Tower before 2,000 spectators, and condemned by a jury of peers that included her own uncle and her former suitor. On the 19th of May, on a scaffold within the Tower walls, she was beheaded with a sword by an executioner brought over specially from Calais. She was the first English queen ever to be publicly executed. She was said to have been calm and to have spoken well and to have joked that she had a little neck. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. Parliament declared her illegitimate, as her sister had been. The title of princess was withdrawn. She became simply the Lady Elizabeth. Her governess, Lady Bryan, wrote an anxious letter to the king's chief minister, pointing out that the child had grown out of all her clothes, that she had no gowns, no kirtles, no petticoats, no smocks, nothing fit to wear, and asking what was to be done about it. There is a story, probably invented later but too good to disappear, that the small girl asked why yesterday she was called Princess, and today only Lady Elizabeth. Whether or not she said it, the lesson underneath it went in early and stayed. Rank was not a fact. Rank was a decision somebody else made about you, and it could be unmade. In October 1537, Jane Seymour finally gave Henry his son. The boy was named Edward. Jane died 12 days later of an infection following the birth, and Henry, who had married 6 women, chose to be buried beside her. Now England had a prince. Elizabeth's position settled into something odd and, in its way, fortunate. She was not the heir. She was not a threat. She was a royal daughter of ambiguous legal status, who could be brought to court on feast days, dressed well, shown off to ambassadors as a marriage possibility, and otherwise left alone in the country with her books. And it turned out that being left alone with her books was the best thing that could have happened to her. The education of Elizabeth Tudor was, by the standards of any century, remarkable. The generation before her had begun to argue, cautiously, that girls of high birth might be taught the same classical curriculum as boys. The argument was made most persuasively by the humanist scholars of the day, who pointed out that a woman who could read Cicero was likely to be a better wife, a better mother, and a better subject than one who could not. It was not a feminist argument. It was, however, an opening, and Elizabeth walked straight through it. She began with the basics under her governess, Catherine Champernowne, later Catherine Ashley, a warm, talkative, not always discreet woman who stayed close to her for nearly 30 years and who Elizabeth loved. Then came the tutors. William Grindal, a young Cambridge scholar, taught her Greek and Latin. When he died of the plague in 1548, Elizabeth insisted, against advice, on having his own teacher instead. His name was Roger Ascham, and he was one of the finest scholars in England. Ascham left an account of her studies that has survived, and it is worth pausing on, because it tells you what the days of her adolescence actually looked like. They began in the morning with Greek. They read the New Testament in the original, then the orations of Isocrates, then the tragedies of Sophocles. In the afternoon came Latin, mostly Cicero and Livy. She read modern theology in Latin and Italian. She wrote out passages, translated them into English, then translated them back into the original days later, and compared her version to the real thing, which is a brutally effective way of learning a language and an equally effective way of learning to notice exactly how an argument is built. Ascham wrote that her mind had no womanly weakness, which he intended as the highest praise available to him. He said her handwriting was beautiful. He said she spoke French and Italian, as well as she spoke English, understood Greek well and Latin perfectly, and had a little Spanish. He said that she liked a style that was clear and plain rather than ornamented, and that she despised showy metaphor. That last detail matters more than it sounds. The woman who would spend 40 years giving speeches to hostile parliaments and sceptical ambassadors learned young how to make a sentence do exactly what she wanted it to do, and no more. She was also learning something less pleasant. In 1543, Henry married his sixth and last wife, Catherine Parr, a twice-widowed noblewoman of 31, sensible, kind, and privately committed to the Reformed religion. Catherine did what none of the others had managed. She gathered the king's 3 children into something resembling a family. Mary, Elizabeth, and the small Prince Edward were brought to court together. Catherine encouraged the studies, corresponded with scholars, and published devotional writing under her own name, which was almost unheard of for a woman. Elizabeth, aged 11, translated a long French religious poem as a New Year's gift for her stepmother, wrote it out in her own careful italic hand, and embroidered the cover herself in silver and blue. The book still exists. You can look at the stitching a clever, anxious child made for a woman who had been kind to her. Henry died in January 1547, monstrously fat, unable to walk, carried between rooms in a chair, his leg ulcerated and stinking. He was 55. The boy Edward, 9 years old, became king, and then came the episode that nearly destroyed Elizabeth before her life had properly begun. Power under a child king went to the boy's uncles, the Seymours. The elder, Edward Seymour, became Lord Protector. The younger, Thomas Seymour, was handsome, charming, loud, reckless, and consumed with envy of his brother. Within months of the old king's death, Thomas married Catherine Parr, the Dowager Queen, with indecent speed. Elizabeth, then 13, was living in Catherine's household. What happened next is recorded in the depositions taken afterward, and it is uncomfortable reading. Thomas Seymour began coming into Elizabeth's bedchamber early in the morning before she was dressed, in his nightgown and slippers. He would pull back the bed curtains, slap her familiarly, tickle her, chase her, while she retreated behind the curtains with her maids, on one occasion in the garden at Hanworth. He held her while Catherine Parr cut her black dress into pieces. Catherine at first joined in, perhaps trying to normalise it, and later found the two of them alone together and sent Elizabeth away. Catherine Parr died in September 1548, days after giving birth. Thomas Seymour, now free, began openly scheming to marry the 15-year-old Elizabeth without the council's permission, which was treason. In January 1549, he was arrested after a botched attempt to get to the young king at night, in the course of which he shot the king's dog. Then the interrogators came for Elizabeth's household. Catherine Ashley was taken to the Tower. So was her financial steward, Thomas Parry. Both talked, and Sir Robert Tyrwhitt was sent to Hatfield to break the girl herself. He failed. She was 15. She was frightened, isolated, and had just been told that her closest attendants were imprisoned, and she gave him nothing. She admitted the things she knew he already had in writing. She denied everything else. She corrected his phrasing. When rumours spread that she was pregnant by Seymour, she did not weep or protest her innocence in general terms. She wrote a cold, precise letter to the Protector, demanding that she be allowed to come to court and show herself to the people, so that the slander could be seen for what it was. Tyrwhitt wrote in exasperation that he could get nothing out of her except by great policy, and that she had a very good wit, and nothing was got from her but by great policy. Thomas Seymour was executed in March 1549. Elizabeth, when told, is said to have remarked that there died a man of much wit and very little judgment. Whether or not she said it, she had learned the lesson it contains. Charm was not safety. Talking was not safety. The only safety was in giving nothing away. She was 15 years old. She had another decade of danger in front of her. The reign of Edward VI lasted 6 years and pushed England hard toward Protestantism. The boy king was clever, cold, and utterly convinced. He had been raised entirely in the Reformed faith, and he meant it. Under his ministers, the change accelerated. The Latin Mass was replaced with services in English. Thomas Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer appeared in 1549, and again, more radically, in 1552, and its cadences would go on shaping the English language for centuries. Altars of stone were pulled out and replaced with wooden tables. Statues came down. Paintings that had covered every parish church in England, with saints and doom scenes and green devils, were whitewashed over and are still occasionally found today under later plaster, staring out. For many people this was liberation. For many others it was the destruction of everything familiar. In the West Country, in 1549, there was open rebellion against the new prayer book. It was put down with foreign mercenaries and considerable slaughter. Elizabeth, through all this, kept her head down and dressed plainly. Her half-sister Mary did the opposite. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She had watched her mother be discarded and die alone, and she held to the old religion with absolute stubbornness. When the council forbade her to hear Mass, she heard it anyway, loudly, with the doors open, and dared them to arrest the emperor's cousin. Then, in the spring of 1553, Edward began to cough, and the coughing did not stop. He was 15. It was probably tuberculosis, and it took months. As he lay dying, his chief minister, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, faced ruin. If Mary succeeded, the Catholic Restoration would come, and Northumberland, who had led the Protestant regime, would not survive it. So a device was drawn up. Edward, who needed no persuading that his Catholic sister must not inherit, wrote out in his own hand a scheme excluding both Mary and Elizabeth from the succession and leaving the crown to his cousin's daughter, Lady Jane Grey. Jane was 16, brilliantly educated, deeply Protestant, and had just been married at Speed to Northumberland's own son. Edward died on the 6th of July 1553. Jane was proclaimed Queen in London. She reigned for 9 days. Because what nobody in Northumberland's calculation had properly weighed was that ordinary English people believed in the legitimate line. Mary was Henry's daughter. Mary was the heir under her father's own Act of Parliament. Mary, warned in time, fled to East Anglia, raised her standard at Framlingham, and the gentry came into her by the hundreds, Protestant as well as Catholic. The council in London read the wind, changed sides, and proclaimed Mary. Northumberland, who had ridden out to catch her, ended up throwing his own cap in the air in Cambridge and shouting for Queen Mary, which did not save him. Mary entered London in triumph in August 1553. Elizabeth rode beside her in a place of honour at the head of 1,000 horsemen. It was the last comfortable moment the two sisters would ever share. Mary I was 37 when she took the throne, and she had waited 20 years in humiliation for it. She intended to spend her reign undoing everything. She restored the Mass. She restored obedience to Rome, negotiated by her cousin Cardinal Pole, and she announced that she would marry Philip of Spain, son and heir of the Emperor Charles V, the most powerful Catholic prince in the world. The religious changes were divisive. The Spanish marriage was something worse. It was, to a great many English people, national humiliation. There was a widespread fear that England would become a province of the Habsburg Empire, that Spanish soldiers would garrison English towns, that English wealth would drain away to fight Spanish wars. In January 1554, that fear became rebellion. Sir Thomas Wyatt, a Kentish gentleman, raised several thousand men and marched on London. It came closer than people remember. The rebels reached Ludgate before the city held, and the rising collapsed. Wyatt was captured. And, under questioning, the name that everybody had been expecting came up. Because, if the rebels had won, and Mary had been deposed, there was only one obvious alternative, and she was 20 years old, Protestant, and the second daughter of Henry VIII. There was no real evidence that Elizabeth had conspired. There was a letter she had not answered. There was a French ambassador's intercepted packet that mentioned her. It was thin, but her sister's advisers, especially the imperial ambassador Simon Renard, argued that thin evidence was sufficient when the alternative was leaving a Protestant claimant alive. On Palm Sunday 1554, in heavy rain, Elizabeth was taken by barge downriver to the Tower of London. She refused at first to leave the boat. She sat down on the wet steps in the rain and said that she was no traitor, but as true a subject as any, and that better sitting here than in a worse place. One of her attendants began to cry, and she rebuked him for it, saying that tears would not help her. She was lodged in the royal apartments, not a dungeon. That was some comfort. It was less comfort that her mother had been lodged in the royal apartments too, and had left them for the scaffold. For 2 months she waited. She was interrogated. She admitted nothing. Wyatt, on the scaffold, publicly exonerated her, which was brave and probably decisive. There was no confession, no signed letter, no witness, and crucially, some of Mary's own counsellors, including the Lord Chancellor Stephen Gardiner, who loathed Elizabeth's religion, would not commit judicial murder without proof. Nobody was willing to sign the warrant. In May, she was released from the Tower and moved to Woodstock in Oxfordshire, a decayed old hunting lodge under house arrest, guarded by Sir Henry Bedingfield, an honest and desperately unhappy man who had been given the worst job in England. She stayed there nearly a year. She walked in the garden. She was not allowed to write letters freely or to see whom she wished. She is supposed to have scratched a line onto a window pane with a diamond, saying that much suspected of her nothing could be proved. Meanwhile, in the country outside, the fires had begun. Between 1555 and 1558, nearly 300 Protestants were burned alive for heresy. Bishops Latimer and Ridley at Oxford, Archbishop Cranmer, who recanted and then recanted his recantation and held his right hand in the flames, weavers and labourers and women in market towns from Kent to Wales. The burnings were public and they were meant to terrify, and instead they created a martyrology that would be printed and read aloud in English parish churches for the next 300 years. Mary, meanwhile, was suffering. Philip came, married her, disliked England, and left. Twice she believed herself pregnant, and twice the pregnancies were phantom, the swelling receding, the ladies falling silent, the Queen sitting on the floor with her knees drawn up. In 1558, England lost Calais, the last English foothold in France, held for over 200 years. She said that when she died, they would find Calais written on her heart. She died on the 17th of November, 1558, probably of cancer, in her early 40s, unloved by her people, having failed at every single thing she had set out to do, and the horseman rode north to Hatfield. She came into London a week later, and the city, which had been sullen for 5 years, went out of its mind with relief. There is a particular quality to English public joy in the 16th century that is hard to translate now. It was noisy, physical, and highly organised. Bells rang from every steeple, and London had well over 100 churches. Bonfires were lit in the streets, and tables were dragged out beside them, and people ate and drank in the road. Cannon fired from the tower. The conduits that carried the city's water were made to run with wine. Her coronation was set for the 15th of January 1559, a date chosen by the mathematician and astrologer John Dee, who had cast the charts to find an auspicious day. The day before, she processed through the city from the Tower to Westminster, and that procession tells you almost everything about how she intended to rule. At 5 points along the route, the city had built elaborate pageants on scaffolds, with children reciting verses, painted allegorical figures, and mottos in English, so that everyone could read them. One showed her grandfather and grandmother uniting the roses of Lancaster and York, and above them her parents, Henry and Anne Boleyn, which was the first public rehabilitation of her mother in 22 years. Another showed a figure of Truth carrying an English Bible which was handed down to her. She took it, kissed it, held it up in both hands, and pressed it to her breast, and the crowd roared. That was theatre, and she knew exactly what she was doing. But the other thing witnesses noticed was smaller and more surprising. She kept stopping. When an old man in the crowd turned away weeping, she asked to know why. When a poor woman offered her a branch of rosemary at Fleet Bridge, she took it, and it was still lying in her litter at Westminster. She talked back to the crowd, loudly, so people could hear. She thanked them. One observer wrote that she was wonderfully ravished with the well-wishing of her subjects, and that her countenance and gestures made the people feel she was theirs. She never lost that instinct. Whatever else she was the first English monarch to understand instinctively that a crowd is not a backdrop but a partner, and that being seen to love your people is a form of power that no army can supply. The coronation itself in Westminster Abbey the following day was a careful compromise. The senior clergy of England were almost all Marian Catholics, and most of them refused to crown a Protestant. In the end, the ceremony was performed by the Bishop of Carlisle, a relatively junior figure who could be persuaded. Parts of the service were in English, At the elevation of the host, the Queen withdrew. The signals were mixed, and they were meant to be mixed. What did England actually get on that day? A young woman of 25 with a slender build, a very pale complexion, reddish gold hair, dark eyes and long, elegant hands that she was vain about and displayed constantly. She had a loud, clear voice and used it. She swore, sometimes shockingly, in the manner of her father. She could be charming to the point of enchantment and cruel to the point of cruelty within the same hour. She loved dancing, hunting, music, and being told she was beautiful, and would go on demanding all four into her 60s. She was also, by any measure, one of the best educated rulers in Europe, fluent in 6 languages, capable of extemporizing a Latin rebuke to a Polish ambassador in front of the whole court, and then remarking cheerfully afterward that she had been forced to scour up her old Latin, and she was a woman ruling alone, which almost everybody in Europe considered a temporary condition that would shortly be corrected by marriage. They were wrong about that for the next 44 years. The first and largest problem was religion, and the settlement she reached in her first year would define England for centuries, understand what she was standing in. In 25 years, the country had officially been Catholic under Rome, then Catholic without Rome, then aggressively Protestant, then Catholic under Rome again with burnings. Parish priests had been ordered to marry, then ordered to put their wives away. Altars had come down and gone back up. Ordinary people had watched the furniture of their eternal souls rearranged 4 times in a single lifetime. Elizabeth's answer was not a triumph of theology. It was a triumph of politics, and it worked because it refused to be precise. The Act of Supremacy in 1559 made her supreme governor of the Church of England, not supreme head as her father had been. The change of word was deliberate. It softened the claim, made it slightly easier for Catholic consciences, and sidestepped the awkward question of a woman heading a church. The Act of Uniformity imposed a single book of common prayer, essentially a revision of the more radical 1552 version, but with certain phrases altered. The words spoken at communion were carefully constructed, so that a person who believed in the real presence of Christ and a person who believed in a purely commemorative meal could both say them honestly. The ornaments and vestments of the old church were largely retained. Cathedral music was preserved, and it flourished. Thomas Tallis, and later William Byrd, who was almost certainly a private Catholic all his life, went on writing music of extraordinary beauty for the Queen's Chapel. Attendance at the parish church on Sundays was made compulsory, with a fine of 12 pence for absence. But there was no attempt at first to police what people thought while they were there. Elizabeth is often quoted, probably not accurately in those words, as saying she had no desire to make windows into men's souls. She may not have said it. She certainly acted on it. The result was a church that satisfied nobody fully, and allowed almost everybody to live. Committed Protestants who had fled abroad under Mary came home from Geneva and Zurich, full of purifying zeal, and were repeatedly disappointed. Committed Catholics went to church, said nothing, and heard Mass privately when a priest could be found. The great mass of the English population, who had never been theologians and did not want to be, went to church, listened to English, sang the psalms, and got on with the harvest. For the first 11 years, this uneasy arrangement held with surprisingly little blood. Then Rome forced the issue. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued a bull declaring Elizabeth a heretic, deposing her, and releasing her subjects from allegiance. It was intended to be devastating. In practice, it was a catastrophe for English Catholics, because it made loyalty to their Queen and loyalty to their faith into an official contradiction, and it turned every Catholic in England into a potential traitor in the eyes of the state. After that, the screws tightened. Seminary priests trained abroad began slipping into England from 1574. Jesuits followed in 1580. Harbouring a priest became a capital offence. Priest holes were built into the walls and chimneys of great Catholic houses, some of them so ingeniously hidden that they were only rediscovered in the 20th century. Men were hanged, drawn and quartered at Tyburn for saying Mass in an attic. Elizabeth herself was, by the standards of her age and family, personally reluctant about religious killing. She had no interest in burning anyone for belief, but she was entirely willing to execute for treason, and after 1570 the two categories had been fused by a decision made in Rome, not in England. Meanwhile, at the very centre of the court, there was a much more human problem, and everybody was talking about it. His name was Robert Dudley. They had known each other since childhood. He was the son of the Duke of Northumberland, the man who had tried to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne, and who had been executed for it. Robert himself had been imprisoned in the Tower at the same time. Elizabeth was there in 1554, which is a bond of a peculiar kind. He was tall, dark, athletic, an outstanding horseman, and by common consent extremely handsome. Within days of her accession, she made him Master of the Horse, a post that required his constant physical presence and gave him control of the royal stables and every royal journey. By the spring of 1559, foreign ambassadors were writing home that the Queen visited his chamber day and night, that he never left her side, that the whole court believed she would marry him. There was one difficulty. He already had a wife. Amy Robsart had been married to Robert Dudley since 1550. She lived in the country, apart from the court, and was said to be ill. In September 1560, she was found dead at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place in Berkshire, with a broken neck. On a day when she had sent all her servants away to a fair, the inquest returned a verdict of accident. Modern historians have suggested that advanced breast cancer can weaken the bones of the spine so that a small fall becomes fatal, which would fit. It may also have been suicide. It was almost certainly not murder ordered by Dudley, because the one thing a man hoping to marry the Queen of England could not afford was for his wife to die suspiciously. But it did not matter what was true. What mattered was what everyone said. And what everyone said, in London and Paris and Madrid, was that the Queen of England's lover had murdered his wife. Marriage to Dudley became impossible in that moment. Elizabeth, whatever she felt, understood it at once. She sent him from court while the inquest ran. She never married him. She also never let him go. He remained the closest man in her life for another 28 years, made Earl of Leicester, given Kenilworth Castle, permitted to build there, and to stage for her in 1575 the most extravagant entertainment ever mounted for an English monarch. 19 days of fireworks, water pageants, hunting and masks that people talked about for a generation. When he married someone else in secret in 1578, she was so angry she threatened to send him to the Tower, and would not receive his wife for the rest of her life. When he died in 1588, she shut herself in her chamber and would not come out until Lord Burghley eventually had the door broken down. Among her most private papers, in the little casket beside her bed, they found after her own death a note in her handwriting. It said simply his last letter. Whether or not she ever intended to marry him is one of the unanswerable questions. What is clear is that after 1560, she had learned that the question of her marriage was the single most valuable piece of political capital she owned, and she was not going to spend it cheaply. For 25 years, the courts of Europe played a game with her, and she won every round of it by never finishing. The logic of the age was simple. A queen must marry. She must produce an heir, or the succession is unsettled, and the kingdom will tear itself apart when she dies. She must have a husband to lead armies and negotiate treaties, because those were not thought to be things a woman could do, and whoever married her would gain England. So the offers came. Philip of Spain himself, her sister's widower, proposed within weeks of her accession, which was awkward for everyone. Eric of Sweden sent his brother with a shipload of gifts and pursued her for years. Archduke Charles of Austria was in play for a decade. The Earl of Arran was floated for Scottish reasons, and from France came the Valois princes, first Henry Duke of Anjou, and then his younger brother Francis, Duke of Alencon. She managed all of them the same way. She was interested, she was gracious. She raised difficulties. Religion was a difficulty. The reaction of Parliament was a difficulty. Her own inclination toward the single life was a difficulty, though of course she would do her duty. Negotiations proceeded, sometimes for years, and while they proceeded, the country in question could not attack England because it hoped to acquire England by other means. She was, in effect, conducting foreign policy with the only major asset an unmarried queen possessed. And she never let it be exhausted. The most serious of them was the last and the strangest. In 1579, when she was 46, the Duke of Alencon came in person. He was 24, short and badly scarred by smallpox. She called him her frog, and by every account of people who knew her well, something in that courtship was genuine. She wept when he left. She wrote a poem, one of the few certainly hers, that begins by saying, "She grieves and dares not show her discontent, that she loves and yet is forced to seem to hate, but the country would not have it." A Puritan lawyer named John Stubbs published a pamphlet denouncing the marriage as a gaping gulf that would swallow England. Elizabeth had his right hand cut off in the marketplace at Westminster. Stubbs, with his stump wrapped, took off his hat with his left hand and shouted, "God save the Queen," before fainting. The crowd stood in complete silence, which frightened the government far more than shouting would have. She let the marriage go. Alencon eventually left with a large sum of money to make war in the Netherlands and died 3 years later. She never came so close again. Why did she really refuse all those decades? Some of it was politics. Any foreign husband would drag England into foreign wars and provoke a faction at home. Any English husband would elevate one noble family over the others and provoke a worse one. She had watched her sister's Spanish marriage produce rebellion within 6 months. Some of it, probably, was fear. She had grown up in a household where marriage killed women. Her mother executed, Catherine Howard, her cousin executed, Jane Seymour dead of childbed fever, Catherine Parr dead of childbed fever. Her sister broken by phantom pregnancies. Childbirth in the 16th century killed a substantial number of the women who attempted it, and there was no reason at all to think a queen was safer. And some of it was simpler still. She had spent her entire youth under the control of other people. Marriage in that century meant, legally and practically, submission to a husband. She had seen exactly what her father did to wives. She had, at last, at 25, come into possession of herself. There is no reason to assume she wanted to give it away. She turned the refusal into an identity. Over time, the propaganda machinery of her court built out of it the figure of the Virgin Queen, married to a kingdom, mother to a people, the Vestal, the Moon, Cynthia, Astraea, Gloriana. Poets ransacked classical mythology for her. Portraits gave her the sieve of the Roman Virgin Tuccia, and the ermine that would die rather than be soiled, and the pearl, which is the emblem of virginity. sewn onto her clothes by the thousand. It was the most successful piece of political image-making in English history. And she built it out of a wound. While she was refusing to marry, another queen 400 miles to the north was marrying rather too much, and her story and Elizabeth's would twist around each other for 30 years like two ropes on a windlass. Mary Stuart became Queen of Scotland when she was 6 days old. She was sent to France at 5, raised at the French court, and married the heir to the French throne at 15. She was tall, close to 6 feet, charming, athletic, and beautiful, in a way that everyone who met her felt obliged to mention. She was also, through her grandmother, Henry VIII's sister, the closest living relative of Elizabeth Tudor, and therefore the next heir to England. And in Catholic eyes, she was not the heir. She was the rightful queen already, because Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn had never been valid, which made Elizabeth a bastard. In 1559, on the death of Mary Tudor, the young Mary Stuart and her French husband had quartered the arms of England with their own. Elizabeth never forgot it. Then Mary's luck ran out. Spectacularly and repeatedly, her husband died at 16 of an ear infection. She went home to a Scotland she barely knew, which had just gone through a Protestant Reformation led by the ferocious John Knox, who had recently published a pamphlet against the monstrous regiment of women, and now had to deal with a young Catholic queen. She managed it at first with real skill and tolerance. Then she married her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a vain, drunken, syphilitic young man of good looks and no judgment, because she wanted an heir with a double claim to England. Darnley, jealous of her Italian secretary David Rizzio, led a gang of armed men into her supper chamber at Holyrood in March 1566, and had Rizzio dragged out and stabbed more than 50 times in the next room. Mary was 6 months pregnant and had a pistol held to her stomach during it. She gave birth to a son, James, that June. In February 1567, the house where Darnley was lodging in Edinburgh, at Kirko Field, was destroyed by a gunpowder explosion in the middle of the night. Darnley's body was found in the garden outside, unmarked by the blast, strangled. 3 months later, Mary married the man everyone in Europe believed had arranged it, the Earl of Bothwell. That was the end. The Scottish nobility rose. Her army melted away without fighting at Carberry Hill. She was imprisoned in a castle on an island in Loch Leven, forced to abdicate in favour of her 1-year-old son, and in May 1568 she escaped, raised an army, lost it in 3/4 of an hour at Langside, and rode south. She crossed the Solway Firth in a fishing boat and landed in England, expecting her cousin to receive her, restore her, and put her back on the Scottish throne. Elizabeth now had the most dangerous guest in Europe on her hands. She could not send Mary back to Scotland, where she would probably be executed, because that would set an unbearable precedent for the killing of anointed queens. She could not send her to France or Spain, where she would become the figurehead of an invasion. She could not restore her by force, and she could not let her go free in England, because every disaffected Catholic in the realm would gather around her. So Mary was detained. It was called protection. It lasted 19 years. She was moved from castle to castle across the Midlands and the North: Bolton, Tutbury, Sheffield, Chatsworth, Wingfield, Chartley, Fotheringhay. She had a household of 30 or more, her own cooks, her own cloth of state, embroidery frames, little dogs, and no freedom at all. She embroidered constantly. Some of her work survives, worked with the Earl of Shrewsbury's wife, Bess of Hardwick. Small emblematic panels of cats and mice, of a hand pruning a barren vine, of a ginger cat crowned watching a mouse. The messages are not hard to read. The two queens never met. They wrote to each other, sometimes warmly, sometimes with beautiful glassy hostility. They exchanged gifts and portraits. They spent 19 years in the same country, 3 days' ride apart, circling, and around Mary the plots began. The pattern repeated with terrible regularity. In 1569, the Northern Rising, in which the great Catholic Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland raised the North, celebrated Mass in Durham Cathedral and marched south to free Mary before collapsing. The retribution was severe. Something like 700 men were hanged in the villages of the north as an example. In 1571, the Ridolfi plot, in which a Florentine banker schemed to have Spanish troops land, Elizabeth killed, and Mary married to the Duke of Norfolk. Norfolk, the premier peer of England and Elizabeth's own cousin, went to the block for it in 1572, and she signed that warrant only after agonising for months and cancelling it twice. In 1583, the Throckmorton plot. In 1586, the Babington plot. Behind the unravelling of every one of them stood a lean, dark-dressed, chronically ill man whom the Queen called her Moor. Sir Francis Walsingham was a Protestant of the deepest dye who had been in Paris as ambassador during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572 and had sheltered English refugees in the embassy while thousands of Huguenots were butchered in the streets outside. He came back with one conviction that never left him. Catholic Europe intended to destroy Protestant England, and only vigilance could prevent it. He built, largely at his own expense, and to his own eventual bankruptcy, the first real intelligence service in English history. He had agents in Rome, Madrid, Paris, Antwerp, Constantinople. He ran double agents inside the English Catholic seminaries abroad. He employed a cipher expert named Thomas Phelips, a small, pockmarked, short-sighted man who could break most codes of the period, and, more usefully, forge them. Elizabeth found Walsingham exhausting and frequently disagreed with him. She was not by temperament a persecutor, and she disliked being pushed, but she kept him, because he was right often enough to be indispensable. And in 1586, he laid the trap that finished Mary Stuart. Mary had been moved to Chartley in Staffordshire, and her letters had been stopped entirely. She was desperate for contact with the outside world. So a channel was offered to. A local brewer delivered beer to the house in barrels. A waterproof case could be slipped into the bung of a barrel. Letters could go out that way, and come in the same way, hidden in the beer. The brewer was working for Walsingham. Every letter went first to Thomas Phelips, who copied it, decrypted it, and sent it on so smoothly that nobody suspected. Mary wrote freely for the first time in years, and every word she wrote was read in London before it reached its destination. Into that channel walked Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman of Derbyshire, romantic, wealthy, and utterly out of his depth. He and a group of friends had convinced themselves that they could assassinate Elizabeth, raise a rising, and bring in a Spanish force. In July 1586, Babington wrote to Mary laying out the whole scheme in detail, including what he called the dispatch of the usurping competitor. Walsingham read it and waited. Everything depended on how Mary answered. On the 17th of July, she answered. She approved. She asked practical questions about how the gentleman would proceed and how she was to be got out at the right moment. Philippes drew a gallows on the outside of the copy he sent to Walsingham. Then, because he could not resist, he forged an additional passage onto the end of Mary's letter, asking for the names of the 6 gentlemen who would perform the deed. Babington, alarmed, did not answer. It hardly mattered, they had enough. The conspirators were rounded up in August, hiding in St. John's Wood with their faces stained with walnut juice. They were hanged, cut down alive, and disemboweled in September. and the crowd was so appalled by the first day's butchery that Elizabeth ordered the second batch to be allowed to hang until dead. Mary was tried at Fotheringhay Castle in October before 36 commissioners. She had no counsel, no witnesses, and no access to her own papers, and she conducted her own defence with considerable dignity, arguing that as an anointed queen she was not subject to English law. She was condemned. Then came 3 months in which Elizabeth would not sign. It is easy to be cynical about this, and many people were at the time. But the difficulty was real, and she understood it better than anyone around her. To execute an anointed sovereign was to say that sovereigns could be executed. It was to hand every regicide in Europe a precedent. It was also, in the plainest terms, the killing of a woman who was her cousin, and who occupied precisely the position Elizabeth herself had occupied in 1554. A royal prisoner accused on the evidence of other men's plots. Parliament petitioned. Her counsel pleaded. She gave what she herself called an answer, answerless, saying that if she should say she would not do it, she might say more than she meant, and if she should say she would, she might plunge herself into peril. She hinted, more than once, that she would be grateful if Mary's keeper, Sir Amias Paulet, would quietly arrange a private killing under the terms of the bond of association. Paulet, a rigid Puritan of absolute integrity, replied that his goods, his life and his all were at her disposal, but that God forbid he should make so foul a shipwreck of his conscience as to shed blood without law or warrant. On the 1st of February 1587, she signed the warrant. She then told her secretary William Davison not to let it go out of his hands. Her council, meeting without her, sent it anyway. Mary Stuart was beheaded in the Great Hall at Fotheringhay on the 8th of February 1587. She was 44. She wore black, and when her women took off the outer gown, she stood in a petticoat and bodice of deep crimson, the liturgical colour of martyrdom, which she had chosen deliberately. The executioner was clumsy. It took 3 strokes. When he lifted the head by the hair to display it, the hair came away in his hand, an auburn wig, and the head that fell was grey and cropped short. Her little dog was found afterward, hiding in her skirts, and would not be coaxed away. Elizabeth's reaction was volcanic. She wept, raged, put on mourning, refused to see her counsellors, and blamed everyone. Davison was sent to the Tower and fined an enormous sum. Burghley was banished from her presence for months. Whether the grief was genuine or theatrical, or, most likely, an unbearable mixture of both, the political purpose was clear enough. She needed Europe to believe that the killing of a queen had happened against her will. Europe did not believe it, and in Madrid, Philip of Spain, who had been considering an invasion of England for years, stopped considering. The road to that invasion had been paved for 2 decades by a group of West Country seamen, who were, depending on where you stood, national heroes or pirates. The Atlantic in the 16th century was legally a Spanish and Portuguese lake, divided between them by papal authority in 1494. Spain drew from its American empire an almost unimaginable flow of silver, above all from the mountain of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, where an entire mountain of ore was mined by forced indigenous labour under conditions that killed men in months. The silver came home in convoys, the treasure fleets, and it paid for the armies that were at that moment trying to crush a Protestant revolt in the Netherlands. English seamen wanted in. John Hawkins of Plymouth. John Hawkins made voyages in the 1560s carrying enslaved West Africans to sell in the Spanish Caribbean, an early and shameful English entry into a trade that would grow monstrous over the following centuries. On the 3rd voyage, in 1568, his fleet was trapped and destroyed by the Spanish at San Juan de Ulua in Mexico. 2 ships got home. On one of them was Hawkins's young kinsman, Francis Drake, who spent the rest of his life treating Spain as a personal enemy. Drake was short, red-bearded, immensely capable, boastful, superstitious, and probably the finest seaman of his age. In 1572, he ambushed a mule train carrying silver across the Isthmus of Panama, and from a tree on the ridge became the first Englishman to see the Pacific, where he prayed aloud that God would grant him life to sail an English ship on that sea. He got his wish in 1577. With 5 ships he went south through the Strait of Magellan up the coast of Chile and Peru, taking Spanish shipping that had never imagined an enemy could reach it. Captured a treasure ship called the Cacafuego, whose cargo took 6 days to transfer, and then, unable to go back the way he had come, kept going across the Pacific, through the Spice Islands, where his ship went aground on a reef and was got off only by throwing cargo overboard, around the Cape of Good Hope, home to Plymouth in September 1580, with 56 survivors out of an original crew of about 160, and treasure worth more than the Crown's entire annual income. Elizabeth had invested in the voyage. She took her share, refused every Spanish demand for restitution, and in April 1581 went aboard the Golden Hind at Deptford and knighted him on his own deck, handing the sword to a French diplomat to do it, so that France would be implicated too. That is the kind of thing she did. By the middle of the 1580s, the undeclared war had become nearly declared. English volunteers had been fighting in the Netherlands for years. In 1585, Elizabeth signed a formal treaty with the Dutch rebels and sent an army of several thousand under Leicester, which achieved very little and cost a great deal, and at Zutphen in 1586, the poet and courtier Philip Sidney was shot in the thigh and died of gangrene 26 days later, having reportedly given his water bottle to a wounded soldier, with the words that the man's need was greater than his own. His funeral was the grandest given to a commoner in the reign. In 1587, Drake sailed into Cadiz harbour and destroyed or captured dozens of ships and thousands of tons of seasoned barrel staves. He called it singeing the King of Spain's beard. The loss of the staves mattered more than the ships, because it meant the Armada's provisions would be packed in green wood, and green wood spoils food and water, but it only delayed things. In the spring of 1588, the greatest fleet Europe had ever assembled began to move out of Lisbon. The Spanish Armada was 130 ships, carrying about 18,000 soldiers and 8,000 sailors, with 2,500 guns. It was commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a competent administrator with no naval experience, who had begged, in writing, to be excused on the grounds that he got seasick and knew nothing about the sea. The plan was not to invade with the fleet. The plan was for the Armada to sail up the Channel, make contact off Flanders with the Duke of Parma's veteran army of the Netherlands, some 17,000 of the best infantry in the world, and ferry them across in barges to land in Kent. That army, not the fleet, was the weapon. If it had landed, the English militia would almost certainly have been destroyed. The English had about 200 ships, most of them small, but including a corps of royal galleons that had been quietly redesigned over 20 years under John Hawkins as Treasurer of the Navy. They were lower, longer, faster, and could sail closer to the wind. They carried heavier long-range guns on lighter carriages that could be reloaded quickly at sea. Spanish tactics still assumed that a sea battle was a land battle that happened on planks, and that you closed, grappled, and boarded. English tactics assumed you never let them get close. The beacons were laid along the coast, chain of bonfires on the high points from Cornwall to the Scottish border, ready to carry the news inland in an hour. On the 19th of July, 1588, they were lit. The story that the English commanders were playing bowls on Plymouth Hoe when the news came, and that Drake insisted there was time to finish the game and beat the Spaniards too, first appears in print decades later. It may be true. It is certainly true that the English fleet could not leave Plymouth immediately, because the tide and wind were against them. So there was, in fact, nothing else to do but wait. They got out that night by warping, hauling the ships out against the wind on their own anchors. And by morning they were behind the Armada with the weather gauge, which is the sailing advantage of being upwind of your enemy. They kept it for the next 9 days. What followed was not a battle in the way people imagine. It was a long-running skirmish up the length of the English Channel, from Plymouth to Portland to the Isle of Wight, in which the Spanish held a crescent formation of superb discipline, and the English hung on the flanks and fired at ranges too great to do much damage. Both sides burned through ammunition. Neither could force a decision. 2 Spanish ships were lost to collision and an accidental explosion rather than to English gunnery. On the 27th of July, the Armada anchored off Calais to wait for Palmer, and Palmer was not ready. He had barges, but the barges were flat-bottomed river craft that could not survive open water in anything but a calm, and the Dutch rebel navy, with its shallow draft, was blockading the coastal channels so that his troops could not even reach the sea in safety. The message had been sent over and over, and never properly understood in Madrid. The whole plan rested on a link that did not exist. That night, the English filled 8 ships with pitch and tar and old rigging, set them alight, and sent them down on the tide into the anchored Spanish fleet. Fire ships were a known danger, and the Spanish had lookout boats out to fend them off. But these were large ships, fully alight, with their guns loaded, so that they fired as the heat reached them. The Spanish captains cut their anchor cables and ran. Not one ship was burned, but the formation, the thing that had made them invulnerable for 9 days, was gone, and it could not be reassembled in the dark. At dawn on the 29th of July, off Gravelines, the English closed at last to musket range and fought for 8 hours in a rising wind. Several Spanish ships were battered to pieces or driven aground. Others were holed at the waterline and could not be repaired at sea. And then the wind shifted into the southwest and drove the whole Armada north into the North Sea, away from Palmer, away from England, and away from any hope. They could not come back down the Channel against that wind. So Medina Sidonia gave the order to go home the long way, north around Scotland, west around Ireland, and south to Spain. Rations were cut. Horses and mules were pushed over the side, and English sailors reported the strange sight of animals swimming in the open sea. It was the voyage home that destroyed them. September in the North Atlantic is not forgiving, and the fleet was under-provisioned, with ropes and casks damaged, charts inadequate, and men already dying of typhus and scurvy. Storm after storm scattered them. Perhaps 24 ships were wrecked on the Irish coast alone, on the Blaskets, in Sligo Bay, at Stridar Strand, where 3 ships went ashore in a single hour, and hundreds of bodies came in on the tide. Some survivors were sheltered by Irish clansmen. Many were killed by the English authorities in Ireland as a matter of policy. Of 130 ships, something like 65 reached Spain. Something like 15,000 men did not come home at all. While the fighting was still going on, Elizabeth had done the most famous thing she ever did. The land army had been mustered at Tilbury, on the north bank of the Thames, to face the invasion that everyone still expected. On the 9th of August, she rode down to review them in a plumed helmet on a grey horse, with a page carrying a silver breastplate. Her counsellors had begged her not to go, on the grounds that assassins would be everywhere. The speech she gave there survives in a version copied by a chaplain who was present, and though the exact words are debated, its argument was hers to the bone. She told them that she had been persuaded by those careful of her safety to take heed, how she committed herself to armed multitudes, but that she did not desire to live to distrust her faithful and loving people. She said that she was resolved, in the midst and heat of the battle, to live and die amongst them all, and to lay down for her God, and for her kingdom, and for her people, her honour and her blood, even in the dust. Then she said the sentence that has outlived every other sentence of her reign. She knew she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but she had the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. It should be understood for what it was. It was not sentiment. It was the answer to the question that had followed her since she was 25 years old, the question of whether a woman could hold this thing, delivered in front of an army at the exact moment when the answer had just been demonstrated at sea. The bells rang for weeks. A medal was struck, bearing the words that God blew, and they were scattered, which was both good theology and an honest account of the meteorology. A service of thanksgiving was held at St. Paul's, with captured Spanish banners hung from the walls. It did not end the war. The war with Spain ground on for another 15 years, expensively and inconclusively, and the English counter-armada to Portugal the following year was a disaster that lost more men than the Armada campaign had. 2 further Spanish armadas were launched in the 1590s, and both were scattered by weather before they arrived. But something had changed that could not be changed back. A small Protestant kingdom had faced the greatest empire on earth and was still standing. And in the theatres that were just then being built on the south bank of the Thames, a generation of young men who had grown up under that shadow began writing as though the English language belonged to them. The extraordinary thing about the Elizabethan literary explosion is how sudden it was, and how tightly packed. In 1576, a carpenter-turned-actor named James Burbage built the first purpose-made public playhouse in England, since Roman times, in Shoreditch, outside the city walls where the Lord Mayor's jurisdiction did not run. He called it, simply, the theatre. Within 20 years there were half a dozen of them, and London, a city of perhaps 200,000 people, was supporting a professional commercial theatre industry, playing to thousands every afternoon. They were round, or many-sided, open to the sky, built of timber with a thatched gallery roof. A flag went up when there was a play. A trumpet sounded 3 times. You paid a penny at the door to stand in the yard around 3 sides of a stage that thrust out into the crowd. Another penny for a bench in the galleries. More for a cushion. The groundlings stood for 3 hours in the weather, eating hazelnuts and oysters, and shells of both have been dug up in their thousands from the excavated floors. Performances began in the early afternoon, because there was no artificial light. There was almost no scenery, which is why the plays describe their own settings so beautifully. There were no actresses. Every woman's part was played by a boy. Into that world came Christopher Marlowe, a cobbler's son from Canterbury, who at 23 wrote Tamburlaine and showed everyone what unheimed iambic pentameter could do when you stopped being polite with it. He wrote Dr. Faustus. He was probably a government agent of some kind, and he was stabbed to death above the eye, in a lodging house in Deptford in 1593, in a quarrel supposedly about the bill at the age of 29, and into it came a glover's son from Warwickshire. William Shakespeare arrived in London sometime around 1590. Almost nothing is known about how or why he acted. He wrote. He became a shareholder in his company, and he made money which most writers of the period did not. In 1599 his company dismantled the theatre in Shoreditch overnight in a property dispute, carried the timbers across the frozen Thames, and rebuilt them on Bankside as the Globe. Under Elizabeth he wrote the history plays, and Romeo and Juliet, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Julius Caesar, and Twelfth Night, and Hamlet. The rest came under her successor. It is impossible to say how much of this was the Queen's doing. She did not commission the great plays. She was not a patron of Shakespeare in any personal sense, though his company performed at court many times, and would later, under James, be called the King's Men. What she did was subtler and more important. She protected the theatre from the London authorities and the preachers, who wanted it closed as a nursery of plague, vice, and sedition, because she liked plays, and because her courtiers liked plays. Acting companies were licensed under the names of great nobles, and that license was the thing that kept the doors open. She also gave the age its subject. A generation obsessed with kingship, legitimacy, succession, usurpation, and the terrible fragility of order, was a generation watching an aging, childless queen and wondering what would happen when she died. Beyond the theatres, the same energy ran everywhere. Edmund Spenser wrote The Fairy Queen, an enormous allegorical poem in which Elizabeth appears refracted as Gloriana, Belphoebe, and Britomart. Philip Sidney wrote sonnets and a defence of poetry. Richard Hakluyt gathered the accounts of English voyages into a vast collection that made the case for a maritime empire. Composers, above all William Byrd and Thomas Morley, and later John Dowland, wrote madrigals and lute songs and keyboard music that had no equal in Europe. And in 1611, 8 years after her death, the Bible that had been translated and retranslated across her whole century was given its final English form. Its rhythms are Tudor rhythms. They came out of her reign. It is worth stepping back from the great events for a while and simply walking through the country she ruled, because most of her subjects lived and died without ever seeing her, and their world had its own quiet shape. The English year still turned on farming. About 4 people in 5 lived in the countryside, in villages of a few hundred souls. The open field system still governed much of the Midlands, where the arable land around a village lay in long unfenced strips, and each household held scattered strips in each field so that good land and bad were shared out. Decisions about ploughing and grazing were made in common at the manor court by men who had known one another all their lives. The rhythm was fixed, ploughing in autumn and again in spring, sowing wheat and rye before winter, barley and oats and peas in the spring. Haymaking in June, the whole village out in the meadows with scythes, the grass falling in swathes, and the smell of it filling the valley for a week. Harvest from late July into September, the most important month of the year, when everyone worked, including children, and when a wet fortnight could mean hunger for 12 months. Then the beasts brought in, the killings brought in, the kill of animals that could not be, overwintered, the salting and smoking, and the long dark from Martinmas to Candlemas, when there was little to do but spin, mend, and keep the fire in. The houses were mostly timber-framed, the panels filled with woven hazel and daubed with clay and dung and straw, the roofs thatched with reed or wheat straw. In the north and west they were stone. Floors were beaten, earth strewn with rushes. Windows in a poor house had shutters and no glass. There was often no chimney in the older cottages, only a hole in the roof, and an open hearth in the middle of the room, and the whole interior was black with smoke, and smelled permanently of it. this was changing. One of the quiet revolutions of the reign was the building of chimneys. An old clergyman named William Harrison, writing in the 1570s, noted with amazement how many chimneys had been put up in his own village within living memory, when there had been only 2 or 3 before, and how the old men grumbled about it. They said that the smoke had been good for a man, hardening the timbers and keeping the family from room, and that now that everyone slept warm, they had gone soft. He also noted the arrival of feather beds and pillows in ordinary farmhouses where the previous generation had slept on straw pallets, with a log for a bolster, and pewter dishes in place of wooden ones. There was more of everything, for the middling sort, than there had been. Food, for a working family, meant bread above all, coarse and dark, made of rye or barley or a mix called maslin. Pottage, a thick vegetable stew of peas, beans, onions, leeks and cabbage, simmered in a pot over the fire with a piece of bacon in it, if there was one. Cheese. Small beer, weak and slightly sour, drunk by everyone including children because it was safer than water. Meat was for feast days and for the well-off. Fish on Fridays and in Lent, which the government enforced not out of piety but to keep the fishing fleet in business, since fishermen were the reserve of the navy. The new foods were arriving, slowly and strangely. The potato came in from South America late in the century, and was regarded with deep suspicion for 100 years. Tobacco arrived and became fashionable at once, smoked in small clay pipes, and by the 1590s London had tobacco shops and people who taught the correct way to blow the smoke. Sugar had become cheap enough that the rich ate great quantities of it, which is why Elizabeth's teeth by her 60s were black and several were missing, and a German visitor noted the fact in his diary. Clothing was regulated by law. Sumptuary statutes laid down who could wear what, by rank and income. Purple silk was reserved to the royal family. Cloth of gold, sable, velvet of certain colours, all had their thresholds. In practice enforcement was patchy, and the rules were constantly broken, but they tell you how the society thought about itself. What you wore was not decoration, it was a statement about where you stood, and dressing above your station was a kind of lie. For the poor, the reign was harder than the legend suggests. The population was growing fast, from perhaps 3 million at the start to 4 million by the end, and land and food could not keep up. Prices rose steeply through the century, while wages lagged. Enclosure, the fencing off of common land for sheep pasture, pushed families off holdings their ancestors had worked. The dissolution of the monasteries had removed, at a stroke, the largest system of poor relief in the country. The result was vagrancy on a scale that terrified the government. Bands of masterless men on the roads. Elizabethan law dealt with them with real brutality. At first, whipping, boring through the ear, branding. But by the end of the reign, in the great Poor Law statutes of 1598 and 1601, something new had been built. Each parish was made responsible for its own poor, with overseers appointed and a compulsory local rate levied to pay for relief. The impotent poor, the old and sick, were to be maintained. The able-bodied were to be set to work. Children were to be apprenticed. It was harsh, and it stigmatized, and it tied people to their birthplace. It was also the foundation of English social welfare, and it lasted, with modifications, for 250 years. The 1590s, the last decade of her reign, were among the grimmest in English history, and the gilding on the age tends to hide it. 4 harvests failed in a row, from 1594 to 1597, the worst run of weather in a century. Grain prices doubled and then doubled again. In the north, in Cumberland and Westmoreland, parish registers record burials of people described as starved and famine deaths that had not been seen in England for generations. Plague returned to London repeatedly, and in bad years the theatres were shut for months at a time. The war with Spain would not end and would not be won. It had spread to Ireland, where the 9 Years' War, under Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, became the most expensive and most brutal conflict of the reign, fought with a savagery on both sides that scarred Anglo-Irish relations permanently. Taxation rose, crown lands were sold. Elizabeth, who hated spending money, almost as a matter of principle, watched the treasury she had spent 30 years husbanding drain into Flanders and Ulster. The great men who had built the reign began to die. Leicester in 1588, weeks after the Armada. Walsingham in 1590, so deep in debt from paying for his own intelligence service that he was buried at night to avoid his creditors. Sir Christopher Hatton. Drake and Hawkins, both dead of disease off the coast of Panama in the winter of 1595 and 1596. On a last unlucky voyage, and both buried at sea. And finally, in 1598, William Cecil, Lord Burghley. Burghley had been with her from the first day. He had been her Secretary of State when she was proclaimed at Hatfield, and he served her for 40 years, cautious, tireless, endlessly writing memoranda in his small, neat hand, with the arguments for and against set out in 2 columns. They quarrelled constantly. She called him her spirit. In his last illness, she visited him and fed him with a spoon herself, because he could no longer lift his own hand, and she wept when he died. Into the space they left stepped a young man who thought the old rules did not apply to him. Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, was Leicester's stepson. He came to court at 18, tall, red-haired, moody, brave, and possessed of a talent for making the Queen furious and then making her forgive him. She was 33 years older than he was. The relationship between them was the strangest of her life and the most destructive. He wanted glory, and he wanted the kind of power that comes from military command. He got some of it. He was at Cadiz in 1596, in a raid that was a genuine success, and that he ensured everyone knew he had led. But he could not tolerate rivals, and he could not tolerate being refused, and he was politically incompetent in a way that Leicester never had been. In a council meeting in 1598, arguing about Ireland, he turned his back on the Queen in contempt. She boxed his ear and told him to go and be hanged. He put his hand on his sword. That should have finished him. It did not quite. In 1599 she gave him the command in Ireland, the largest army ever sent there, 16,000 men, and everything that could go wrong did. He wasted the season marching in the south, avoided Tyrone, lost thousands of men to disease and desertion, and finally met Tyrone alone, at a ford, on horseback, with the water running between them, and agreed a truce that gave away everything. Then he abandoned his post, rode for England, and burst unannounced high into her private bedchamber at Nonsuch Palace one morning, muddy from the road, before she had been dressed or had her wig put on. She was 66 years old, and he saw her as she was. She was extraordinarily calm about it in the moment. She was not calm afterward. He was placed under house arrest, stripped of his offices, and, most damagingly, refused the renewal of his monopoly on the import of sweet wines, which was the entire foundation of his finances. In February 1601, ruined and desperate, he attempted a coup. On the afternoon before, his supporters paid Shakespeare's company to stage Richard II, the play about the deposition of a monarch, at the Globe. The next morning Essex rode into the city of London with about 200 men, expecting the citizens to rise for him. Nobody rose. The streets were quiet. He was back at Essex House by afternoon, negotiating surrender. He was tried and beheaded in the Tower on the 25th of February 1601. He was 33. Elizabeth signed the warrant without any of the agony that had attended Mary Stuart's. She was reported to have been playing the virginals when they told her it was done. She had 2 years left, and she spent them growing quieter. In the autumn of 1601, she faced a parliament that was in a genuinely rebellious mood over monopolies. Monopolies were exclusive rights to trade in some commodity, granted by the Crown as a cheap way of rewarding courtiers without paying them. And by the end of the reign, they covered salt, starch, vinegar, playing cards, currants, and much else, and they had become a serious tax on ordinary life. When the list was read aloud in the Commons, a member is supposed to have called out asking whether bread was on it. And the House fell silent, and then someone said that if the Queen did not act, bread would be there before the next Parliament. She acted at once. She cancelled the worst of the grants by commissions, by proclamation, before the House could legislate, which was politically astute, since it kept the initiative in her hands. Then she summoned about 140 members to Whitehall and spoke to them. It is remembered as the Golden Speech, and it is the last great public performance of her life. She told them that there was no jewel, be it of never so rich a price, which she set before the jewel of their love, for she did more esteem it than any treasure or riches. She said that, though God had raised her high, yet this she counted the glory of her crown, that she had reigned with their loves. She told them that she had never been a greedy, scraping grasper, nor a straight, fast-holding prince, but that what they gave her she had received to bestow on them again. And then, near the end, she said the thing that seems to have made grown men weep in the room, that, though they had had, and might have, many mightier and wiser princes sitting in that seat, they never had, nor should have, any that loved them better. She was 68 years old, and she had been on the throne for 43 years. Almost nobody in the country could remember another monarch. The last winter came in early 1603. Her old friend and cousin Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham, died in February, and it seems to have taken something out of her that did not come back. She refused to go to bed. She stood for hours, one hand on a cushion, and would not lie down, and when they pressed her, she said that if they had seen what she had seen in bed, they would not persuade her. Eventually they laid cushions on the floor of the Privy Chamber at Richmond, and she lay on those, on her side, with a finger in her mouth, staring at nothing. She would not eat, would not take medicine, would not have her physicians. She had an abscess in her throat that made speech difficult. Her hair was thin under the wigs. She had refused to be treated by anyone for years, and had made her doctors' lives a misery. Her counsellors came to ask about the succession, which she had refused for 45 years to name, and got, at the end, either a nod or a gesture, or nothing at all, depending on which account you believe. In practice, it had been arranged already. Son Robert Cecil had been in secret correspondence with James VI of Scotland, the son of the woman Elizabeth had executed for years. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, knelt beside her and prayed. He was old himself, and his knees hurt, and twice he tried to rise, and twice she made a sign that he should continue. It was the last thing she asked anyone to do. She died between 2 and 3 in the morning on the 24th of March 1603, in her sleep at Richmond Palace. It was said afterward that she went as the most resplendent sun setteth at last in a western cloud. A ring was taken from her finger and dropped from a window to a horseman waiting below, and he rode north to Edinburgh, changing horses, and covered 400 miles in under 3 days and told James Stuart that he was King of England. The reaction in London was strange and telling. There was no disorder. There was, according to those who wrote about it, a great silence. People had been dreading her death for 20 years, expecting civil war, expecting Spanish landings, expecting the world to come apart. Instead, a Scottish king was proclaimed at the cross in Cheapside, and the shops opened the next day. She was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 28th of April. The effigy on the coffin was so lifelike, in its robes and crown, that the crowd along the streets groaned and wept when it passed. She lies now in a vault in the north aisle of the Henry VII Chapel, under a white marble monument that James paid for. Beneath her, in the same vault, without a monument of her own, lies her sister Mary. A Latin inscription on the tomb notes that they are partners both in throne and grave, sisters here in the hope of resurrection. Across the chapel, on the other side, James put up a larger and more expensive tomb for his own mother, Mary Stuart, whose body he had brought from Peterborough. The two cousins who never met in life lie about 30 paces apart, and the crowds file between them all day. Let us step away from the endings now, and look instead at some of the smaller things, the ones that made up the texture of her days. Begin with her face, because almost everything you think you know about it is a construction. There are perhaps a dozen portrait types of Elizabeth that were repeatedly copied, and the number of surviving versions runs into the hundreds. They were not, in the modern sense, portraits from life. She sat rarely. What happened instead was that an approved face pattern was produced, and workshops across the country reproduced it onto new bodies, in new dresses, with new symbols, for patrons who wanted the Queen on their wall as a statement of loyalty. In 1563, a draft proclamation was drawn up to prohibit unauthorized likenesses until an official pattern could be established, because the images being sold were so bad and so various. By the 1590s, the Privy Council was ordering unseemly portraits to be sought out and burned. The result is that as the real woman aged, the painted one did not. The pattern used in the last 15 years of the reign is known as the Mask of Youth. It shows a smooth, unlined white face with a high forehead, small mouth and dark alert eyes, and it was used on women in their 60s without alteration. It was not vanity in a simple sense. The monarch's body was understood to have two natures, the natural body that decayed and the political body that did not, and the portraits were painting the second one. The dresses in those pictures are worth looking at slowly. They are covered and covered again with meaning. Pearls, hundreds of them, sewn onto sleeves and bodice, and hung in ropes to the waist, standing for purity. Eyes and ears embroidered across a cloak in one famous portrait, so that the Queen wears the fact that she sees and hears everything. A rainbow held in one hand with the motto that there is no rainbow without the sun. A serpent on a sleeve for wisdom, holding a heart-shaped ruby. A globe under her hand with English ships behind her. The real clothes were as extraordinary. The inventory taken at her death listed something over 1,000 items of clothing, gowns of cloth of silver, of white satin embroidered with sea monsters, of black velvet with gold aglets. The great standing collars of wired lace, stiffened with the new starch that a Dutch woman had brought to London, which grew in the 1580s and 1590s, to the width of a cartwheel and required a support of wire called a supportass to hold them up. Underneath was a scaffolding of construction, a stiffened bodice with whalebone, a farthingale, first the cone-shaped Spanish version, and later the French drum-shaped one that made the skirt stand straight out from the waist and fall vertically, sleeves that detached and could be swapped, everything pinned and a wealthy woman could go through hundreds of pins in a year. The making of an image, then, was a physical labour, performed daily by a small group of women who were among the most trusted people in the kingdom. The ladies of the bedchamber dressed her, kept her jewels, slept in her room, and were the only people who saw her without any of it. Blanche Parry, who had rocked her cradle, served her for 56 years and went blind in her service. Catherine Ashley, the governess, who had been questioned in the Tower, was chief gentlewoman until she died. Elizabeth's world was full of women who had known her since, before she was anybody, and she kept them close all her life. Every summer, for most of her reign, the Queen went travelling, and the whole apparatus of government went with her. The royal progress was an old custom that Elizabeth turned into an instrument. Between roughly June and September, she would leave London and move slowly through the southern and midland counties, staying at her own houses and, more often, at the houses of her nobility and gentry, who were expected to receive her and everyone she brought. Everyone she brought was a small town. The court on progress could run to 400 carts and 2,000 horses. The wardrobe went, packed in standard chests. The kitchens went. The chapel went, with its singers. The council went, and papers were signed, and ambassadors received in whatever great chamber happened to be available that week. Roads that were adequate for a farm wagon had to carry the Queen's coach, and parishes along the route were required to mend them beforehand, which is one reason the progress was not always popular. For the host, a royal visit was a catastrophe and an opportunity in roughly equal measure. It could cost a fortune. Houses were extended, sometimes rebuilt, in the hope of a visit. Sir Christopher Hatton built Holdenby in Northamptonshire, one of the largest houses in England, expressly for a visit that never came, and wrote that he kept it as a shrine to the saint for whom it was made. Others were ruined outright by 3 days of hospitality. But if it went well, it was the single most valuable thing that could happen to a family. It meant favour. It meant that the Queen had eaten your food and walked in your garden, and that everyone knew it, so the entertainments became extravagant. Leicester's 19 days at Kenilworth in 1575 remain the high watermark. There was a floating island on the lake, lit with torches, on which a woman, playing the Lady of the Lake, glided toward the Queen reciting verse. There was a mechanical dolphin 24 feet long, with musicians inside it. There were fireworks that went on for hours, and were audible 20 miles away. There was a bear baiting, which she enjoyed, and hunting every day, and a masque that was cancelled because it rained. At other houses she was met at the gate by allegorical figures, by hermits emerging from artificial caves, by shepherds, by savage men covered in ivy. She was addressed as Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice, whose return would restore the Golden Age. She sat through hundreds of hours of amateur Latin verse, with apparently perfect composure, and was famous for making some gracious remark afterward that the family would repeat for 3 generations. What the progresses achieved was simple and enormous. They put the Queen physically in front of tens of thousands of people who would otherwise never have seen a monarch at all. The road was lined, in every village she passed, with people who had walked in from the surrounding parishes to stand and look. She stopped for them. She took their flowers and their petitions. She let herself be looked at. There was a cost to it that she probably understood better than anyone. The image she had built required constant maintenance and constant display, and there was no version of her life, in which she was allowed to be off-duty in public. Even in her 60s, in bad weather, on bad roads, with an aching back, she got out of the litter and stood so the people could see her. Consider then the ordinary shape of a day at court, since that was where she spent the other 9 months. She rose late by the standards of the century, often not appearing until the middle of the morning, because dressing was a long business. Before that, in her privy chamber, she would walk, read, and deal with the first papers. She translated for pleasure all her life, and, in her last years, she made an English version of Boethius, the Roman philosopher's consolation written in prison, awaiting execution. Apparently, in about a month, in her own increasingly wild handwriting. The public parts of the palace worked outward like a set of nested boxes. Anyone respectable could get into the great hall. Fewer got into the presence chamber, where the empty throne stood under a canopy, and where courtiers bowed to the chair itself, whether or not she was in it. Fewer still reached the privy chamber. Almost nobody entered the bedchamber. Position in the household was measured entirely by how far in you were allowed to go, and men spent their whole lives and fortunes trying to move one room closer. Meals were formal and enormous, and largely uneaten by her. The ceremony of laying the table for a monarch involved tasting for poison, ritual bowing, and a procession of dishes carried in by guards. She herself ate sparingly, drank watered wine, and often took her food privately. The afternoons might bring hunting, which she loved and continued into old age, shooting deer with a crossbow from a standing platform when she could no longer ride hard, or hawking, or walking in the gardens, which under the Tudors had become elaborate arrangements of raised walks, not gardens laid out in low-clipped hedges of box and hyssop and thrift, arbours of trained fruit trees, and long galleries covered with vines for shade. Evenings brought music and dancing. She played the virginals and the lute well, and was once caught playing alone by a Scottish ambassador, who had been deliberately placed where he could overhear. She danced the galliard, which involves leaping into her 50s, and there is a report of her dancing 6 or 7 galliards in a morning as exercise. There were plays at Christmas and Shrovetide, card games, and enormous quantities of gambling. Underneath all of it ran the business of government, which never stopped. The Privy Council met most days, sometimes in her presence, more often not. Petitions arrived by the sack. Her method of ruling was, famously, to delay. Ambassadors and councillors alike went half mad with it. Decisions were postponed, reversed, postponed again. Letters were written and then held back. She would agree to a course of action, allow it to be prepared, and then refuse to sign at the last moment. Some of this was temperament. Much of it was strategy. She had almost no army, a small navy, a modest revenue, and a country divided in religion, wedged between two vastly richer Catholic powers. Delay was the tool available to a weak state. Time changed circumstances. A war postponed might become a war avoided. She was frequently wrong, and her hesitations cost lives in the Netherlands and elsewhere. But the record of 44 years is that she kept England out of the catastrophic land wars that consumed France for a generation, and bankrupted Spain 3 times. Meanwhile, at the edges of her world, English ships were going further than they had ever gone, and beginning something whose consequences she could not possibly have foreseen. The Muscovy Company had been founded in her sister's reign, after Richard Chancellor sailed northeast looking for a passage to China, and instead reached the White Sea and travelled overland to Moscow, where he met Ivan IV. Trade in furs, wax, tallow, and cordage followed, and English merchants lived in Moscow and Vologda in walled compounds. The Levant Company was chartered in 1581, sending broadcloth and tin to Constantinople, and bringing home currants, silk, and spices. Elizabeth corresponded with the Ottoman Sultan Murad III, and the letters are a fascinating exercise in mutual flattery, in which she stresses that the English, like the Turks, reject the worship of idols, which was a pointed contrast with Spain. In 1600, the East India Company received its charter on the last day of the year, a group of London merchants pooling capital for a voyage to the Spice Islands. It was a modest and rather speculative undertaking. It would take 150 years to become the machine that governed a subcontinent. And in the Americas, there were the first English attempts at settlement, which failed. Sir Humphrey Gilbert claimed Newfoundland in 1583 and was lost on the way home, last seen sitting in the stern of his tiny ship in a heavy sea with a book in his hand, calling across to the other vessel that they were as near to heaven by sea as by land. His half-brother Walter Raleigh took up the patent, and in 1585 and again in 1587 sent colonists to an island called Roanoke, off the coast of what they named Virginia after the Queen. The second group, more than 100 men, women and children, was left there while their governor went home for supplies. The Armada crisis meant no ship could be spared for 3 years. When John White finally got back in 1590, on his granddaughter's 3rd birthday, the settlement was empty. The houses had been taken down carefully rather than destroyed. There was no sign of a struggle. Carved on a post was the word Croatoan, the name of a nearby island and a friendly people, and a storm prevented him from sailing there to look. Nobody knows what happened to them. It remains the oldest unsolved disappearance in English America. And the child born there, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, vanished with the rest. These were small beginnings and mostly unprofitable ones. But the pattern that would define the next 3 centuries was laid down in her reign in charters granted to companies of merchants who raised their own capital and took their own risks, with the Crown lending a name and a licence and taking a share. Come back to London for a while, because the city she ruled from was changing faster than anything else in the kingdom. At her accession, perhaps 70,000 people lived there. By her death, it was approaching 200,000, and it had become the largest city in Northern Europe. Almost all of that growth was immigration, because the death rate inside the walls was higher than the birth rate. The city ate people and drew in more from the countryside, from Kent and Essex and the Midlands, and from abroad, French and Dutch Protestant refugees who brought weaving, silk work, printing, and the art of making starch. The shape of it was medieval and bursting. The old wall still stood, with its gates at Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Moorgate, Crippergate, Aldersgate, Newgate and Ludgate, and the gates were shut at night. Inside, the streets were narrow, unpaved in places, and the houses leaned out over them, story by story, until neighbours could shake hands across the upper floors. Signs hung from every shop front, painted boards swinging on iron brackets, because most people could not read, and a business was known by its picture: the bell, the 3 cranes, the mermaid. Above it all stood the old St. Paul's Cathedral, far larger than the building that replaced it, whose spire had been struck by lightning and burned in 1561, and was never rebuilt. The nave, known as Paul's Walk, functioned as the busiest public space in England. People met there to do business, hire servants, read the notices pinned to the pillars, and be seen. Booksellers filled the churchyard outside. Preachers drew enormous crowds at the open-air pulpit, called Paul's Cross, and the government used it, effectively, as a broadcasting station. The river was the main road. Watermen, of whom there were thousands, rowed passengers up and down and across, shouting for custom, and the standard cry for a boat going upstream was eastward ho, and the other westward ho, which is where the phrases come from. London Bridge, with its 20 arches, narrowed the flow so much that the water fell several feet through the gaps and made a roar you could hear a long way off. Shooting the bridge in a small boat was genuinely dangerous, and sensible passengers got out and walked around. On the bridge itself, at the southern gatehouse, the heads of executed traitors were displayed on poles, parboiled and tarred to preserve them. A German visitor in 1598 counted more than 30. The smells were formidable. Tanneries and dyers on the outskirts, breweries, the fish market at Billingsgate, the meat market at Smithfield, where the animals were driven in live and butchered on the spot, and everywhere the accumulating waste of a city with no drains that worked. Rakers were employed to carry the refuse out. Pigs wandered. The Fleet River had become an open sewer and would stay one for centuries, and yet, to a young man arriving from a village of 200 people, it must have been astonishing beyond describing. Shops selling goods from Aleppo and Moscow and the Indies. The Royal Exchange, built by Thomas Gresham in 1571 and opened by the Queen, a great courtyard of arcades with 100 small shops above, where you could buy books, armour, glass, mousetraps and bird cages. Goldsmiths Row in Cheapside, the most magnificent street in England, its houses 4 stories high, painted and gilded, and beyond the walls, southward across the bridge, the liberties of Southwark, where the city's rules did not apply. The bear gardens, the brothels, licensed for centuries and known bluntly as the stews, the prisons, and, from the 1590s, the theatres, the Rose, and then the Globe, standing in the marsh among the ditches and the dog kennels, where 3,000 people at a time paid a penny to hear the finest verse ever written in English. Underneath the surface of all this lay a world of belief that was not yet divided into science and magic, and it is worth understanding because it shaped how everybody thought about their own bodies. Medicine still ran on the theory of the 4 humours, inherited from the Greeks by way of the Arab physicians. The body contained blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and health was their balance. Each had qualities of heat and cold, moisture and dryness. Illness was in balance, and the remedies were designed to restore it. Bleeding, by lancet or by leeches, was the standard treatment for a great many conditions. Purging was the other. Diet was prescribed by the qualities of the food, so that a hot, dry patient would be given cool, moist things. Astrology was part of medicine, not opposed to it. A physician was expected to know the position of the moon before undertaking anything serious, and almanacs printed for ordinary readers gave the days good for letting blood and the days good for planting. The great London physician Simon Forman kept case books that survive, thousands of consultations in which patients came for a diagnosis, based on the moment they asked the question, and were treated for everything from plague to unrequited love. Surgery existed, and was brutal and occasionally brilliant. There was no anaesthetic beyond alcohol and opium, no understanding of infection, and no reliable way to stop bleeding except cautery. Yet military surgeons, who saw enormous numbers of injuries, made real advances in the treatment of gunshot wounds, chiefly by discovering that pouring boiling oil into them made things worse. Plague came and went. It was endemic, flaring into epidemics every 10 or 20 years, and the outbreaks of 1563, 1593, and 1603 each killed a substantial fraction of London's population. Nobody knew what caused it. The theories were bad air rising from filth, or divine punishment, or the conjunction of planets. The responses were quarantine, the shutting up of infected houses, with a red cross painted on the door, and a watchman outside, the killing of stray dogs and cats, and the flight of anyone with somewhere to go. The rats and the fleas they carried went unnoticed. Alongside all this ran witchcraft. An Act of 1563 made it a felony, and prosecutions rose through the reign. Though English witch trials were far less lethal than those in Scotland or on the continent, and torture was not legally used to obtain confessions. The accused were mostly poor old women who had quarrelled with a neighbour before a cow died. It was a village crime born of proximity and grudges. And in the same years, in the same country, men were beginning to measure things. Dr. John Dee, who had chosen the coronation date, owned the largest private library in England, some 4,000 volumes at a time when a university library might hold 600. He taught navigation to the captains of the Muscovy Company, advocated the reform of the calendar, and coined the phrase British Empire. He also spent years attempting to converse with angels through a scryer using a crystal, and saw no contradiction between the two activities, because for him they were the same inquiry. Thomas Digges published a defence of the Copernican system in 1576, and went beyond Copernicus by proposing that the stars were not fixed on a sphere but extended infinitely into space, which was a genuinely startling idea. William Gilbert, the Queen's own physician at the end of her life, published in 1600 a study of the magnet, based on experiment rather than authority, concluded that the Earth itself was a great magnet, and in doing so wrote one of the first recognisably modern scientific books in England. The world was not yet disenchanted, but the tools that would disenchant it were being made in her reign, often by the same hands that cast horoscopes. There is one more thing her age built that you can still walk into, and that is the houses. The dissolution of the monasteries had put an extraordinary quantity of land into the hands of a new gentry, and 40 years later that gentry had money and wanted to show it. The result was a building boom, sometimes called the Great Rebuilding, and it produced a kind of house that had never existed before. Medieval great houses were defensive, inward-looking, arranged around courtyards, with thick walls and small windows, and a great hall at the centre where everyone ate together. The new Elizabethan houses abandoned all of that. They were built outward, symmetrical, often on an E or H plan, with enormous windows, because glass had become affordable, and displaying it was the point. The most famous of them is Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, built in the 1590s by Bess of Hardwick, who had been Mary Stuart's keeper for years and who married 4 times, each husband richer than the last, and who ended as the second wealthiest woman in England after the Queen. Hardwick rises out of the hill with rows of tall windows increasing in height, story by story, and her own initials cut in stone along the roofline against the sky. The rhyme about it says that it is more glass than wall, and standing in front of it you can see why. Inside, the innovation was the long gallery, a room running the whole length of an upper floor, sometimes over 150 feet, hung with pictures and tapestries, used for walking in bad weather, for conversation, and for display. The great chamber replaced the hall as the main room of state. Private rooms multiplied. For the first time, wealthy people expected to be able to be alone. They filled these houses with plaster ceilings moulded in intricate patterns, with carved oak panelling, with tapestries bought from Flanders, and with the beginnings of picture collections. The furniture was heavy and dark, joined oak with bulbous carved legs. Beds were the single most valuable object a household owned, hung with embroidered curtains, and were left by name in wills. Outside the gardens were laid out to be seen from those windows, in geometric knots and parterres, with mounts built up, so that you could climb and look down on the pattern. There were fountains, banqueting houses on the walls, for the sweet course after dinner, and orchards of apples and pears, and the newly fashionable apricot. Many of these houses are still standing, in Derbyshire and Northamptonshire and Somerset and Wiltshire. They were built by people who expected to be visited by a queen, and some of them were, and some of them waited in vain, and either way, the buildings outlasted everyone concerned. Consider too how the country was actually governed, because it was not governed the way people usually imagine. There was no police force, there was no standing army, there was no civil service beyond a few hundred men in Westminster. The Crown had no permanent armed power to compel anybody to do anything, and the total number of paid royal officials in the whole kingdom would not have filled a modern government department. England was run, instead, by unpaid amateurs who did it for status. At the top sat the Privy Council, which under Elizabeth was deliberately kept small, usually fewer than 20 men, at times as few as 11. Burghley dominated it for 40 years. It met most days, drafted policy, ran finance, handled security, wrote to the counties, and answered to her alone. She attended when she chose. She frequently overruled it and frequently ignored it, and its members spent a great deal of their lives trying to maneuver her into decisions she did not want to make. Below that came Parliament, which was not a government but an event. She called it 13 times in 44 years, and it sat for a total of about 3 years out of 44. Its purpose from the Crown's point of view was to grant taxation and pass statutes, and it was expected to go home afterward. The Commons were increasingly full of educated gentlemen with legal training who had opinions about religion, the succession, monopolies, and the Queen of Scots, and who had discovered that a claim to free speech within the chamber was a useful lever. Elizabeth managed them by a combination of charm, flattery, the occasional imprisonment of a member in the Tower for going too far, and an absolute refusal to discuss the two subjects she considered her own, her marriage and the succession. The real machinery, though, was in the counties, and its name was the Justice of the Peace. A justice was a local gentleman, appointed by commission, unpaid, serving among his neighbours. There were perhaps 40 or 50 in a county. He heard minor cases alone in his own parlour, sat quarterly with his colleagues at quarter sessions to try more serious matters, licensed alehouses, set wage rates, examined suspects, supervised the overseers of the poor, mustered the militia, mended the bridges, and chased vagrants. The statute book piled duty after duty onto him across the century until a manual for justices ran to hundreds of pages. Why would anyone do it? Because it was the definition of local standing. To be left off the Commission of the Peace was a public humiliation that families felt for generations. The Tudor state discovered that it could govern a kingdom almost for free, provided it paid in prestige. Beneath the justice came the parish, which, by the end of the reign, had become the basic unit of English administration. As well as of worship, the parish had a vestry, churchwardens, an overseer of the poor, a surveyor of highways, and a constable, all of them local men serving in rotation, mostly reluctantly. The constable was expected to arrest his own neighbours, which is why constables in the plays of the period are always comic and always useless. Serious crime went to the assizes, where royal judges came out twice a year on circuit, riding from county town to county town with considerable ceremony, met at the boundary by the sheriff and a body of gentlemen. The assize was a public occasion. The trumpets, the sermon, the charge to the grand jury, and then the trials, which were extremely fast. A felony trial might take 20 minutes. There was no defence counsel. The accused spoke for himself. Punishment was physical and public, because the state had no capacity to imprison people for long. Prisons were mostly holding places for people awaiting trial or awaiting payment of debts, so the sentences were the pillory, the stocks, whipping at the cart's tail, through the market, branding on the thumb, the cutting of ears, and hanging. Theft above the value of 12 pence was in principle a capital crime, though juries habitually valued stolen goods at 11 pence to avoid hanging someone, a practice so widespread it had a name. There was one enormous loophole, benefit of clergy, by which a first offender who could read a verse of the Psalter, the so-called neck verse, could claim to be a cleric and escape hanging, being branded instead. Since literacy was rising, the effect was to spare a growing number of men from the gallows, which is a very Tudor way to reform a legal system by accident. The church courts ran alongside all of this, dealing with morals, wills, marriage disputes, slander and church attendance. And they touched ordinary lives more often than the criminal law did. They could not hang anyone. They could order penance, which meant standing in the church porch in a white sheet, holding a candle in front of your neighbours, and in a village of 200 people that was a real punishment. What holds the picture together is that this was government by consent to a degree that is easy to miss. The Crown could not enforce anything. The local gentry refused to enforce. Statutes were regularly ignored in counties where nobody cared for them. Recusant Catholic gentlemen were quietly not prosecuted by justices who happened to be their cousins. The system worked because most people in most places found it easier to cooperate than not. Elizabeth understood this perfectly. It is the reason she was so careful with her nobility, so reluctant to raise taxes, so insistent on being seen and loved, and so unwilling to push religious conformity into people's private houses. She had no other means of compulsion. Her authority rested on the belief that she was the rightful queen, and on the willingness of several thousand country gentlemen to act on that belief without being paid. For 44 years, they did. Something else was spreading through that society, quietly, and it may have mattered more in the long run than any of the wars. People were learning to read. The grammar school was the engine of it. Many had existed before, attached to monasteries and chantries, and a good number had been destroyed when those were dissolved. Under Edward and Elizabeth, dozens were refounded and new ones endowed, usually by a wealthy merchant or landowner, leaving money in his will, and by the end of the reign most market towns of any size had one. They were free, or nearly so, for local boys. The curriculum was narrow and relentless, Latin and more Latin. Boys began at about 7, having already learned their letters from a hornbook, which was a sheet of paper with the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer on it, mounted on a wooden paddle and covered with a thin sheet of translucent horn to keep it clean. School began at 6 in the morning in summer, 7 in winter, and ran until 5 with a break at midday. They learned grammar by rote, then read Aesop, then Cicero and Ovid and Virgil, then practiced writing Latin verse and prose and arguing both sides of a set question in a formal exercise. Beating was routine and considered pedagogically sound. It sounds joyless, and much of it was. It also produced, in one general, a body of men from ordinary backgrounds who had spent 10 years being trained in rhetoric, in the construction of an argument, in the deliberate handling of a metaphor, and in taking a position and defending it. Marlowe was a shoemaker's son at the King's School, Canterbury. Shakespeare, on all the evidence, went to the free grammar school at Stratford, and no further. The literary explosion of the 1590s was made by scholarship boys. Girls, with a handful of aristocratic exceptions like the Queen herself, did not go. Some learned to read at home or at a dame school, and a growing minority of women could read even if they could not write, since the two were taught as separate skills at different stages, and many pupils left after the first. Alongside the schools ran the presses. Printing had come to England in the 1470s, and by Elizabeth's reign, London had a working publishing trade regulated through the Stationers' Company, which held a monopoly and also served the government as a mechanism of censorship. Books were expensive. But the presses did not only make books. They made ballads, single sheets, printed on one side, sold for a penny by peddlers, and hawked in the streets, carrying a song about a murder, a monstrous birth, a shipwreck, a battle, a scandal, or a love affair, set to a tune everybody already knew. They were pinned up on the walls of alehouses and cottages. They were sung. Something like 3,000 of them survive. And they are the closest thing we have to the popular voice of the period. They made almanacs, which, after the Bible, were the best-selling printed items in England, giving the calendar, the phases of the moon, the tides, the dates of fairs, medical advice, and prophecies, and they made cheap religious books, catechisms, psalters, and the Bible itself in English, in the Geneva version, with its marginal notes, small enough to be carried, and cheap enough for a yeoman family to own. That was the single greatest change. For the first time, ordinary literate English people could read for themselves the text. That all the arguments had been about, and they did, and they argued about it, and the habit of private reading and private conclusion took hold and never let go. Beneath the reading and the wars and the politics, ordinary lives went on being lived, and their shape is worth knowing. People married later than you might expect. The average age at first marriage was around 26 for men and 24 for women, because a couple were expected to have the means to set up an independent household before they wed, and that took years of saving from service or apprenticeship. Perhaps a tenth of the population never married at all. Aristocratic marriages were arranged and could happen much younger, but that was a small minority. Courtship among ordinary people had its own customs, gifts exchanged, gloves and ribbons, and a bent coin. A promise made before witnesses, called a handfast or spousal, which was legally binding in ways that later caused endless trouble in the church courts. A substantial number of brides were pregnant at the wedding, which the community generally tolerated, provided the wedding happened. Childbirth was women's territory, absolutely. The chamber was darkened, the keyhole stopped, the room filled with the mother's female relatives and neighbours, and a midwife who was licensed by the church rather than by any medical body. Men were excluded entirely. Afterward, the mother lay in for several weeks and then went to church for a ceremony of thanksgiving. Something like 1 birth in 40 killed the mother, and each woman might give birth 6 or 8 times. Infant mortality was appalling by our standards and ordinary by theirs. Perhaps a quarter of children died before their 10th birthday, more in the towns. Parish registers are full of it. This did not, as older historians once suggested, make parents indifferent. The letters and the wills and the memorials say otherwise. It made them frightened, and it made them religious. And it made the moments of survival sweeter. Children of the middling sort left home early, often at 12 or 14, to go into service or apprenticeship in another household, where they lived as part of the family and were disciplined by the master. A great many English households therefore contained young people who were not related to anyone in them. Foreign visitors found this cold and remarked on it. It was one of the deep structures of English social life, and it lasted for centuries. Old age, for those who reached it, meant either the support of children or a place in an almshouse endowed by some pious founder, or the parish rate. There was no retirement. People worked until they could not, and death was a public and communal event. The dying person was expected to make a good end, in company, forgiving debts and enemies, with prayers said aloud. The body was washed and wrapped by the women of the neighbourhood. After 1666, the law would require a woolen shroud to support the cloth trade, but in Elizabeth's time it was linen. The bell tolled. The parish walked to the churchyard. There was no headstone for most people, only a grave in ground that would be reused within a generation. That was the whole ark, for the 4 million people alive under her. And it was the same ark it had been for their grandparents and would be for their grandchildren. What was different in her 44 years was that England was at peace with itself for longer than it had been in living memory, and that the peace held. One more thread deserves its own space, and that is music, because it ran through every level of that society, and it was the thing foreigners praised most. At court, music was constant. There was a permanent establishment of players, lutes, viols, recorders, sackbuts and shawms, some of them Italian families who had come over under Henry and stayed for generations. There were the singers of the Chapel Royal who travelled with the court and sang the daily services, and were, by common consent, the finest choir in Europe. Elizabeth herself played and expected the people around her to play. Thomas Tallis served 4 monarchs and survived every change of religion by writing superbly for whichever one was in charge. In about 1570, he wrote a motet for 40 independent voices, 8 choirs of 5 parts each, designed to be sung in a room, with the choirs arranged around the walls so that the sound moved physically around the listener. It is one of the most extraordinary pieces of the century, and it still stops people in their tracks. His pupil, William Byrd, was greater still. Byrd was a Catholic who never conformed, whose family were repeatedly fined for recusancy, and who was nevertheless protected by the Queen for 40 years because she valued him. He wrote Anglican services for the establishment, and, at the same time, masses in 3, 4, and 5 parts, printed without a title page, intended to be sung quietly in the private chapels of Catholic households by a handful of singers. They are music written for people who might be arrested for singing it, and you can hear that in them. Below the professionals came the amateurs, and this is where the English reputation was made. The madrigal arrived from Italy in the 1580s and was taken up with enormous enthusiasm. Thomas Morley published collections and a textbook on how to compose. In 1601, he gathered 25 composers to write pieces in the Queen's honour, all ending with the same line about Oriana, and published them together. The expectation in a moderately educated household was that after supper, the part books would come out, and everybody would sing. There is a well-known joke of the period about a guest who is handed a part and cannot read it, and is quietly assumed to have had a poor upbringing. Instruments were everywhere, the lute above all, difficult, fashionable, and expensive. The virginals, a small plucked keyboard that sat on a table. Viols in sets, from treble to bass, kept in a chest, so that a household could field a consort. And then there was John Dowland, the greatest songwriter of the age, who set melancholy to music better than anyone before or since, and whose most famous piece, a slow pavane built on a falling phrase, was arranged and rearranged across Europe for decades. He complained bitterly, all his life, that he had never been given a place at the English court, and made a Latin pun of his own name, meaning always doleful, and it is hard to escape the suspicion that he found the pose useful. In the streets and villages, the music was different and largely unwritten. Ballads sung to a stock of shared tunes, dance music for the ordinary rounds and jigs played on pipe and tabor, by one man who could manage both a 3-holed pipe in one hand and a small drum struck with the other. Bells Waits, the town musicians paid by the corporation to play at civic occasions and to walk the streets on winter mornings. Carols, work songs, lullabies. Almost none of that was written down, and most of it is gone, but it is worth remembering. When you picture that world, that it was rarely silent, and that a great deal of the noise in it was people singing, think for a moment about the England that lay outside all of this, in the dark while the court danced and the councillors wrote. At night, the country went quiet in a way that is now almost impossible to imagine. There was no light anywhere except fire. In a village, once the last rushlight was pinched out, the only illumination was the moon, and whatever glow came from a banked hearth. Rushlights were made by peeling a rush, leaving one strip of the green skin for strength, and drawing the pith through hot fat, usually mutton fat, saved from cooking. A rush of about 2 feet burned for something under an hour, with a small clear flame, and cost almost nothing. Candles of tallow were dearer, and smelled of grease. Candles of beeswax were for churches and the rich. Curfew, from the French for cover the fire, was rung in towns, and the ashes were raked over the embers so that a spark would still be there in the morning. Getting fire from nothing meant flint and steel and char cloth and patience, so nobody let the fire go out if they could help. People went to bed early, and, according to a good deal of evidence, often slept in 2 shifts. There was a first sleep and a second sleep, with an interval in the middle of the night, when people woke naturally, lay in the dark, prayed, talked quietly with whoever was beside them, tended the fire, and then slept again until dawn. Writers of the period refer to it casually, the way we might refer to a lunch break, as something everyone knew about. The seasons were felt in the body, in a way we have mostly lost. Winter meant real cold indoors. Summer meant working while the light lasted, which in June in England is a very long time. The church year still marked the calendar even after the Reformation had stripped away most of the saints. Plough, Monday after 12th night, when the plough was blessed and dragged around the village. Shrove Tuesday, and its pancakes and its riotous football matches between whole parishes. Easter, May Day, with the pole and the greenery and the complaints of the preachers. Whitsun ales, midsummer bonfires on the hills, still lit in many places when the young people jumped the flames. Harvest home, with the last sheaf carried in on a cart, and a supper for everyone who had worked. Sound carried differently too. Church bells were the loudest thing most people ever heard, and every parish had its own peal, and the ringing was information. Bells for services, bells for weddings, the passing bell for a death, tolled once for each year of the dead person's life, so that anyone in the fields could count and know who it was. Elizabeth's England contained all of that, and it was going on continuously in 10,000 parishes, entirely indifferent to whether the Duke of Alencon was in favour that month. She left surprisingly little in her own voice, and what she did leave is worth pausing on, because it is unlike anybody else's. There are the speeches, some in her own draft, with corrections. There are letters, hundreds of them, ranging from formal Latin to the sharp, funny, slightly bullying English she used with people she trusted. There are prayers she wrote in several languages. There are a handful of poems and a set of translations. The prose is dense, coiled, and often deliberately hard to pin down. She liked long sentences that turn back on themselves, subordinate clauses stacked so that the main verb arrives late, and a kind of grand evasiveness that could be read 2 ways by 2 different ambassadors. This was learned young in interrogation rooms, and she never lost it. But when she wanted to be plain, she could be devastating. to a parliament pressing her to marry in 1559. She said that in the end this shall be for her sufficient, that a marble stone shall declare that a queen, having reigned such a time, lived and died a virgin. To Parliament again on the subject of Mary Stuart. She said that as for her own life, she would not desire to live longer than her life, and reign should be for their good. To the Polish ambassador, who had lectured her in Latin in front of the whole court, she stood up and answered him extempore in Latin, so fiercely that the room applauded, and then turned to her courtiers and said, cheerfully, that she had been forced this day to scour up her old Latin that had long lain rusting. There is a note in the margin of a letter in her hand telling a correspondent to burn it. There is the little casket beside her bed with Leicester's last letter in it. There is a translation of Boethius made at 66, the philosopher in his cell, explaining that fortune's wheel turns, and that nothing held is held. For long, she was, in the deepest sense, a professional. She had learned as a child that words were the only weapon available to a person with no power, and she used them for the rest of her life, with the precision of someone who had once needed them to survive. What did she actually leave behind? Not a dynasty. The Tudors ended with her after 5 monarchs and 118 years. The crown went to the son of the woman she had executed, and the Stuarts would spend the next century failing to manage the parliament she had handled by charm, by delay, and by the accumulated credit of 44 years. Not wealth. She left debts, though modest ones by continental standards, and a war in Ireland that her successor had to finish. Not, in the way it is often claimed, an empire. The empire came later, and most of the ventures of her reign lost money. What she left was a set of habits and instruments, chartered companies, a permanent navy of real quality, a merchant marine, and a national conviction that the sea was where English business lay. What she did leave, unambiguously, were 3 things. The first is the church. The Elizabethan settlement, that deliberately ambiguous compromise of 1559, survived. It was strained by Puritans, attacked by Catholics, and nearly destroyed in the civil wars of the next century. But the shape she gave it, episcopal, liturgical, national, broad enough to hold people who disagreed, is recognisably the shape it still has. She created it not out of theological conviction, but out of a determination that people should not be killed for what they believed in private, at a moment in European history when that was a genuinely unusual ambition. The second is the language. The English of 1558 was a provincial tongue that educated men apologised for. The English of 1603 had Shakespeare in it, and Marlowe, and Spencer, and Sidney, and the Psalms in the prayer book, and the vocabulary that the King James Bible would fix 8 years later. This was not her achievement, but it happened under her protection, and she understood better than any English monarch before her what words could do. The third is harder to name. She demonstrated, over 44 years, in front of the whole of Europe, that a woman could hold sovereign power alone and not lose it. Every argument said she could not. Knox had written that female rule was repugnant to nature. Her own council assumed from the first day that the arrangement was temporary. Ambassadors reported home for decades that the matter would shortly be settled by a husband. She outlived all of them, and she outlived Philip of Spain, who had ruled half the world and buried 3 wives, and could not conquer her. She was not a good person in any simple sense. She was vain, capricious, and could be startlingly cruel. She let good men rot while she made up her mind. She presided over the conquest of Ireland with a callousness that produced atrocities. She took her cut of Drake's piracy and Hawkins's slaving. She executed a queen and a favourite and Catholic priests whose only crime was the Mass, but she inherited a bankrupt, divided, humiliated country that had burned 300 of its own people in 3 years. And she died in a country that was at peace with itself, that had beaten the greatest empire on earth, and that was writing Hamlet. The myth began almost immediately. Within a decade of her death, people who had grumbled about her taxes and her monopolies were remembering Good Queen Bess. Her accession day, the 17th of November, went on being celebrated with bells and bonfires for 2 centuries, long after anyone alive could remember what she had looked like. Every subsequent age remade her. The 18th century made her a Protestant heroine. The 19th made her the founder of empire. The 20th put her in films, played by great actresses in extraordinary dresses, and asked repeatedly whether the woman was ever allowed to exist beneath the crown. That question has no answer, and she made sure of it. She burned what she wanted burned. She sat for portraits that were not portraits. She spoke in sentences that could be read 2 ways. The historian is left with an enormous archive of paper and almost nothing certain about the interior of the person. Perhaps that was the point. Let it settle then, the way things settle at the end of a long day. Think of the girl of 2 in a house at Hatfield, whose clothes no longer fitted and whose mother had gone. Think of the girl of 15, alone in a cold room, giving a clever man nothing. Think of the young woman on the wet steps in the rain, saying that she was no traitor, and the year of walking in the garden at Woodstock, waiting to hear whether she would live. Think of the horseman in the November Park, and the Latin line about a marvellous thing. Think of the barges and the torches, the bells of 100 churches, the wine running in the conduits, the winter chambers and the summer roads, the long boring hours of council business, and the endless unsigned papers, the dancing, the hunting, the virginals played alone in a room, the ambassadors going home baffled again. Think of the beacons going up along the coast on a July evening, one after another, from headland to headland, and the small ships going out on the tide. And think of the last quiet room at Richmond, the cushions on the floor, the old archbishop kneeling with his aching knees, and the hand that motioned him to keep praying. The bells rang for her, tolled once for each of her 69 years, and the sound went out over the fields and the woods and the river, and then it stopped, and it was only the wind again. The names grow faint now, the dates loosen and drift. Somewhere a fire is being banked for the night, and the ashes are being raked over the embers so that a spark will still be there in the morning. Rest now. Let the story go. Sleep well, and good night.